Hi, this is Lori Marks. In part 2 of the June 2022 WPE workshop, I'll provide a review of the essays in the reading set with advice about how to employ those essays in your own essay. A script of this video is available on the workshops page of the Writing Proficiency website. If you're looking for strategies to write a passing essay, please watch part 1 of the workshop. I'm just going to start with some general information about events that are coming up. First, if you want a detailed review and discussion of the readings, consider attending some reading labs. Check the weekly mailing for the current schedule. That mailing also will tell you how to sign up for individual tutoring, but we often run out of appointments. You can drop in for last-minute help on June 2nd. Then we provide draft reviews June 2nd and June 3rd. For the draft reviews, you just have to schedule an appointment. But don't worry about fitting this appointment into your schedule. You're just scheduling a half hour of staff time. And all you need to do is to email us your draft before that appointment time. You'll receive feedback on your draft by email. In this talk, I'm primarily going to focus on how these readings are relevant to your project, rather than try to tell you what each essay in the reading set is saying. I'll follow this review with a more detailed discussion of one of the more difficult passages in the reading set. You'll notice that these slides are illustrated by images of trees that are mentioned in the reading set. When you work with sources, you should always check the author's credentials, the publisher, or the provider of the material you're working with, and the audience it's intended for. All three selections in this reading set are book chapters that we have edited. The books were published in 2011, 2014, and 2020. To make it easier for you to follow along, I'll discuss them in the order they appear in the reading set. But in your own essay, there's no reason you should discuss them in any particular order. The first reading is by George Montbiot. He's the author of a book called Feral, and the chapter we're using is titled Greeting the Desert. Montbiot is a British writer and journalist known for his environmental and political activism. On his website, montbiot.com, he writes, quote, "We should defend the biosphere that gives us life, both because it is wonderful and because those of us who possess agency, who are alive today and have money, have no right to deprive others who are not yet born or who are poor of their means of survival." His book, Feral, explores a new positive environmentalism that shows how damaged ecosystems on land and at sea can be restored, and how this restoration can revitalize and enrich our lives. That was a quote from his publisher's website. His book, first published in Great Britain, is intended for a general audience of interested readers. The second book chapter is from a book titled Places of Memory. And that book is a collection of essays, each one with a different author, that investigate how places memorialize past events. Paola Filippucci's chapter is on the landscape surrounding the World War I battlefield of Verdun. Filippucci teaches and researches in the field of social anthropology at Murray Edwards College in Cambridge in the United Kingdom. This book is intended for an academic audience. Also, it's intended for researchers and students who are interested in the topic. The third selection is from a book titled Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. Its author, Mark Hertzgard, is an American journalist and author of 7 books. Since the 1990s, he has focused his energy and attention on environmental issues, particularly climate change. As I discuss these essays, bear in mind that you may use them in any order you wish, and I encourage you to discuss 2 or 3 of them in the same paragraph. Also, I'll provide some quotations from the readings as examples of how the reading can be relevant to answering the prompt. But there are many ways these essays could be deployed in your argument, and you should not limit yourself to the few examples I'll discuss here. Following each review, I'll discuss a difficult passage from each essay. I'll keep reminding you of your essay topic, which is, what are the benefits of restoring trees and forests in these barren places? In other situations in which areas have been deforested, would it be beneficial to restore the forests? Why or why not? We'll begin with George Montbiot and the chapter from his book Feral. Remember, Montbiot is an activist and writer with an interest in ecology, and his book is about a positive environmentalism that focuses on ways the environment can be restored. In this selection, he discusses a place in Wales in western Great Britain. The region of Wales encompasses a couple of mountain ranges, the Cambrian Mountains and Snowdonia. Both mountain ranges are primarily covered with grass, but scientific evidence suggests they used to be forest. In this chapter, Montbiot isn't making an argument or actively trying to prove anything in his chapter. He describes the mountains in their current state, and then he describes an area to which forest has been restored. He doesn't tell us what to think about these contrasting descriptions. Instead, by showing them to us, he is implying an argument or inviting us to interpret it for ourselves. So this is what he appears to be investigating. How did the Cambrian Mountains get into this condition? What would be the impact if this area were restored to a forested state? For your essay, the prompt directs you to discuss the benefits of forest restoration and to judge whether restoring forests would be worth doing in other situations. When you set out to discuss Montbiot's chapter, you won't be able to just copy his ideas because he doesn't tell us what to think about these contrasting examples. Instead, you'll have to figure out what he thinks based on what he observes about these 2 contrasting examples. So, as an example, here's a table that contrasts a few of his observations, so you can see how this might work. On page 4, regarding the place that lacks trees, Montbiot observes an absence of wildlife. By contrast, on pages 6 to 8, in the area that has been reforested, he names 6 different kinds of birds that he observed during his visit. Therefore, you can conclude that there is a lot more wildlife in the area that has been restored. Similarly, on page 6, Montbiot writes that, quote, sheep rapidly deplete nutritious and palatable plants, leaving behind a remarkably impoverished flora. And by the way, the word flora is a scientific term that means all plants in the region. So he's saying that the number of different kinds of plants is impoverished or reduced. There are still a lot of plants, but there's only a few kinds of plants. Then, on page 7 alone, he names 9 kinds of plants that he observed during his visit to the reforested area. And if you count the number of plants he lists that he sees throughout his visit to the reforested area, there actually are a lot more. This is just those that appear on page 7, which includes bracken, birch, toadstools, moss, bilberry, fern, foxglove, alder, and sallow. Along with discussing the benefits of forest restoration in your essay, you also need to judge whether restoring forests would be worth doing in other situations. You should base this aspect of your paper on your own judgment and logic, but you probably will find it useful to launch your own ideas from the ideas in the reading set. For example, I think it's clear that Montbiot is impressed by the restored woodland, and he probably thinks that more reforested areas would be beneficial. For example, look at this quotation from page 5. He writes, quote, "I wonder whether our campaigns against deforestation elsewhere in the world, commendable as they may be, are a way of not seeing what happened in our own country." He's addressing his fellow Britons who are opposed to deforestation in places like the Amazon, where the forests are steadily being cut down so that farmers can use the land to raise cattle. He's suggesting that people in his country who are opposed to deforestation in another country should also pay attention to the deforestation that has already happened in their own country's past. As an example, in the United States, we have lost a lot of forest. I did some quick research and found that after the arrival of Europeans to this continent, half of our forests were cut down, and none of them have been restored. So would it be beneficial for us, the people in the United States, to restore at least some of our lost forests, which, like those in the Cambrian Mountains, were removed for farming hundreds of years ago? This is the kind of question you should be addressing in your own essay. Now I'm going to discuss a passage from Montbiot's essay that you might find difficult. Unfortunately, I can't explain the entire reading set to you, but I hope to help you to find your way through the most difficult passages that I identified in each of these readings. In Montbiot's essay, he bases his assertion that the Cambrian Mountains used to be forested on some science research. He writes on page 4 to 5, 8,000 years ago, the plant life was still affected by the cold, dry conditions following the retreat of the ice. Trees, hazel, oak, alder, willow, pine, and birch, accounted for about 30% of the pollen based on pollen core studies, and grass for much of the rest. As the weather became wetter and colder, elm, lime, and ash trees started to move in. The woods became deeper and darker. By 4,500 years ago, trees produced over 70% of the pollen. Heather pollen, by contrast, supplied around 5%. A pollen core study is done when scientists use drills to remove a column of soil or peat, which they can then study microscopically to determine what kind of pollen appears in which layers. This tells them what kinds of plants were prevalent at a particular time. So Montbiot is saying that these studies show that immediately after the Ice Age, trees weren't very prevalent. But as the climate warmed, the number of trees increased until the trees were contributing 70% of the pollen. So this is the basis for his argument that the Cambrian mountains used to be forested. Let's move on to discuss the next essay, which is Paola Filippucci's chapter on the landscape surrounding the World War I battlefield of Verdun, France. We normally think of deforestation as a thing that happens when humans remove trees so they can use the land for farming or habitation. But the forested land around Verdun was destroyed by war. It's not just that the trees and plants were obliterated by shelling, but the soil was damaged and polluted by toxins, the shape of the terrain was altered, and the land was polluted by military debris. All of this happened more than 100 years ago, but some areas are still off limits due to the dangerous toxins from chemical warfare. You don't have to know a lot about World War I to understand this chapter, but if you feel like you need to know a bit more, send a request to our email address and we'll send you a link to a YouTube video that gives a real quick basic review of how the battle began in Verdun. Filippucci is interested in the symbolic role that the forest plays in memorializing the Battle of Verdun. So her project is more directly sociological or psychological by comparison to Montbiot's. She states her project most directly on page 10, where she writes, quote, "Nature was presented in the memorial forest as the agent ensuring a physically and morally viable future for the former battlefield. Creating a forest was an acceptable way to restore life there in a way that respected and honored the dead and their sacrifice." So the purpose of the decision to restore and preserve the forest had to do with its symbolism. The living forest on the battlefield was understood to be a good way to respect and honor the people who died there. Remember, you're writing your essay on this topic. What are the benefits of restoring trees and forests in these barren places? While Filippucci's essay emphasizes the forest's role in memorializing a terrible event, which is beneficial to individual people and societies, her essay also discusses some of the environmental benefits that have resulted from the forest. In my talk, I'm not going to discuss the environmental benefits, but don't overlook them. Regarding psychological benefits, on page 9, Filippucci writes, quote, "The decision not to reconstruct the farmlands responded to the desire to commemorate a battle that for the French had become emblematic of the whole war." So she's saying that when the war was over, the government decided not to turn the battlefield over to farming and other uses, but to allow it to be forested instead. The people of France during World War I were deeply traumatized by the war, and the Battle of Verdun in particular had become symbolic of the horrors and losses they had experienced. So they decided not to put the landscape to practical use, and instead they established it as a National Heritage Site and a national forest. You could compare this to the site of the Twin Towers in New York City that were destroyed on 9/11. Rather than just rebuild those buildings in the same footprint, the area became a memorial for the people who died that day. We memorialize our national tragedies because they help us to heal and to recover from them. For future generations, however, these memorials help them to feel and understand a history that they don't actually remember, as you may not remember 9/11. This is a point that Filippucci makes on page 10. In the time of history, its victims are no longer remembered directly or even indirectly, and we must instead learn about war from impersonal sources such as school, books, film, and so on. This is a sociological benefit because a society is held together in part by its history, and therefore it's important that its members understand the history that they themselves don't remember. So, one last thing about Filippucci, I want you to remember that in addition to writing about the benefits of restoration, you're also supposed to apply those benefits to other situations. With Filippucci's essay, those other situations may not necessarily be other battlefields. What she says in her essay could apply to any place that needs to be memorialized, such as, for example, the place that one of the planes crashed on 9/11 in Pennsylvania, which is now a national park. Also, you could apply Filippucci's example to other situations that the land has been torn up or polluted. So, regarding a difficult passage in Filippucci's essay, I think that you might find Filippucci's essay the most difficult of the three essays in the reading set because her language use is complex and she discusses some topics that you might feel a little alienating. Here's a passage on page 10 that I think is worth making the effort to understand. In this passage, she's explaining how people of 1916 understood the symbolism of nature and why this became important in memorializing the battle. She wrote, "The symbolism of nature as a force of renewal and regeneration in the midst of death and destruction was common in contemporary accounts of the ruins of war. And in the case of Verdun, it was deployed to argue that abandoning the former battlefield would lead to uncontrolled regrowth and so to oblivion, while orderly and homogeneous plantations would assist memory by keeping the ground clear and accessible. Pilgrims would be able to kneel at spots that they recognize under a verdant, which is green and lush, silent canopy disturbed only by birdsong and by the weeping of the wind. Nature could be harnessed to show respect for the dead by framing and enhancing the majesty of burials and monuments, fostering reflection and meditation as Verdun became an immense sanctuary and national park of French remembrance." Amazingly enough, this is just two long sentences, and it does take some work to figure out how the parts of each sentence are working together grammatically. So rereading will help a lot with sentences like this. First, Filippucci says that nature was often understood to be a force of renewal in the midst of death and destruction. Then she says that it was common for this symbolism to be applied to war. So that symbolism was used to make an argument regarding Verdun, that it would be better to manage the regrowth of the forest by planting some places and leaving other places clear so that people can make use of them for remembering, such as by visiting important sites of the battle or walking through the cemetery. Then she gives us some of the words and phrases that people of the times were using to make the argument that Verdun should be a park. These are the words that are in quotation marks here. The word pilgrim, the words kneel at spots that they recognize, and so on. These words really emphasize that the grief and loss that people were experiencing, that it needs to be respected. And they argue that Verdun should be a sanctuary for people who are grieving. So now I'm going to switch to Mark Hertzgard's book. It's a book on climate change, and this is a chapter on farming in a country in Africa that's called Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso is in a semi-arid climate zone called the Sahel, which is bounded on the north by the Sahara Desert. The Sahara is the largest desert in the world, and it encompasses about a third of the African continent. In Burkina Faso, they get a lot of rain during the rainy season, which lasts about 4 months, and they get very little rain during the remaining 8 months. It's a very hot climate with highs between 93 and 101 year-round. Most of the people in this country are subsistence farmers, which means they're growing enough food to feed themselves, but they aren't earning very much income. In Burkina Faso, it used to be that trees that didn't belong to the farmers, and the farmers would pull up the seedlings because they were afraid of being fined for using the trees or any tree products. This is not true anymore about Burkina Faso, but what happened during the time that the trees didn't belong to farmers is that the farmers lost the knowledge of the value of growing trees on their properties. So Hertzgard tells about a farmer named Sourdough who started experimenting to improve his crop yield during a period of drought. Sourdough discovered that if he allowed trees to grow among his crops, he had a better yield. Soon he was teaching his methods to other farmers, and the entire region rapidly began to be covered with trees. As part of this selection, we've given you some images of satellite photos, which display the difference between 1975 and 2005 in terms of their tree coverage, and it really is astonishing how many more trees there are. The reading set, or the selection, does tell the total number of trees that they think have been planted, and it's millions of trees. One last reminder that your topic is this: what are the benefits of restoring trees and forests in these barren faces? So we'll talk about the benefits of restoring trees to Burkina Faso. The people of this region have so little income that they can't afford to actually plant trees. But tree seeds are carried in the dung of their animals, and the farmers don't even have to plant them. All they have to do is allow the young tree to remain where it started to grow. Since these trees are native to the area, they're adapted to the hot and dry environment, and they don't require any particular care for them to continue to grow. So Hertzgard reports on a lot of different benefits for allowing these trees to grow, but I'm just going to give you examples related to food security and increased income. I'm sure that you'll be able to see a lot of these other benefits as well. Regarding food security, Hertzgard writes, water availability and crop yields had increased substantially. Before, this field couldn't fill even one granary, Sourdough said. Now it fills one granary and half of another, which is roughly a 50% increase in production. For subsistence farmers, this kind of increase in food could mean that they don't starve or die in bad years. Also, growing trees among the crops gives farmers another source of income. Hertzgard writes, quote, wood is the main energy source in rural Africa, and as his tree cover expanded, Sourdough sold wood for cooking, furniture making, and construction, thus increasing and diversifying his income. So these are two of the benefits of allowing these trees to grow in among the crops on his farm. To apply the example of the Burkina Faso farmers to other situations, you might think about how climate change may reduce the rainfall in some places and how farmers who depend on rainfall might be able to adapt. Also, you could think about other places in the world that people depend on subsistence farming, or about hot and dry places where reintroducing trees could be beneficial. Hertzgard's chapter isn't difficult to read, but here's one of his slightly more difficult passages. The development workers, which is the people who are working with non-governmental organizations to improve living conditions in that country, they use the term farmer-managed natural regeneration, which in this essay is abbreviated as FMNR. So these are farming practices such as those that are being used in Burkina Faso. Here's the passage, which is on page 14. Recognizing farmers' property rights was equally crucial in Niger, according to Tony Rinaldo, an Australian missionary and development worker who was one of the original champions of FMNR, Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration. The great thing about FMNR is that it's free for farmers, Rinaldo told me. They stop seeing trees as weeds and start seeing them as assets, but only if they're not penalized for doing so. In Niger, said Ronaldo, FMNR had a hard time gaining traction until he and others convinced government officials to suspend enforcement of the regulations against cutting trees. Once farmers felt they owned the trees in their fields, FMNR took off, Ronaldo recalled. There are a lot of economic reasons why this farming practice works, but here Tony Rinaldo is talking about the psychological reasons that it works. When the trees shift from belonging to the state to belonging to the farmer's attitude towards the trees changes. They aren't weeds, they're assets. It reminds me of a disagreement I had with my neighbor last year. I noticed that he had a native columbine plant growing in his lawn, and I told him what a beautiful plant it was, and I expressed my envy that he had this plant. But as soon as my back was turned, he mowed the plant down. To him, it was a weed. So you might gather that one reason I relate so much to this reading set is due to my own experience of turning my own yard from a green desert, which was a lawn and a few shrubs, into a naturalistic garden filled with plants and trees that are native to my region. As a result, my yard provides an environment that supports insects, birds, rabbits, and other wildlife, while my neighbor's yard is a green desert. This is the end of the workshop. I do recommend that you read these essays at least twice, take notes, and mark significant passages. For many people, reading comprehension is better if you work on a paper copy of the readings rather than reading them on screen. And finally, always, as always, contact us if you have any questions.